times.
I'm Philip Uri. This is the 25th year of the Emil Bustani Middle East Seminar. That's a pretty long time by any measure within the Academy. There are some seminars that are older. It is just a delight for me, a pleasure really, to welcome Andrew Bacevich to us. He is a familiar face. He spoke here last fall. In fact, I tried to get him to come in the fall, but he said, I just spoke at MIT. I have nothing else to say. We know that's not true. Anyone who's read him will tell you he has a lot to say. And so I'm grateful that he's here, and I think you all will be too. Let me just say, we will have a second session in this semester on April 5th. Dear friend Malise Ruthven, if you read the text, but Ruthven by his pronunciation, who is a writer and historian, had been with the BBC, is going to talk about fundamentalists and other obstacles to religious tolerance here at 4:30 on April 5th, and we'll get some publicity about that. Andrew Bacevich is Professor of International Relations and History at Boston University. He's a graduate of the U.S. Military Academy. He received his PhD in American Diplomatic History from Princeton, and before joining the faculty at BU, he taught at West Point and at Johns Hopkins. He is the author of Washington Rules, America's Path to Permanent War, which appeared in just this past year. His previous books include The Limits of Power, The End of American Exceptionalism, 2008, The Long War, A New History of U.S. National Security Policy Since World War II, in 2007, which he edited, The New American Militarism, How Americans Are Seduced by War, in 2005, and American Empire, The Realities and Consequences of U.S. Diplomacy, and that was in 2002. His essays and reviews have appeared in a variety of scholarly journals and general interest publications, including the Wilson Quarterly, The National Interest, Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, The Nation, and The New Republic. And his op-eds have appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Boston Globe, and many, many other places. He was a Berlin Prize Fellow at the American Academy in Berlin, and he's also had fellowships at the Paul A. Tutsi School of Advanced International Studies, the JFK School of Government, now called the Harvard Kennedy School, and the Council on Foreign Relations. Andrew, delight to have you.
Well, thank you very much. I'm actually not mic'd up, and so if the people in the back can't hear me, just wave your hands and we'll get mic'd up. I am very grateful for the invitation to speak. It will soon become evident that I am not a Middle East expert. As the titles of my books suggest, my beat is sort of contemporary U.S. foreign policy, U.S. national security policy. The presentation I'm going to make, which I haven't given before, but I think it's going to go about 40-45 minutes, will probably reflect this preoccupation with U.S. policy. I'm not apologizing for that, but probably ought to lay that out at the outset. My aim this afternoon is to assess as dispassionately as possible the current state of U.S.-Israeli relations by evaluating the compatibility or incompatibility of U.S. and Israeli interests. In doing so, I'm not implying that interests alone provide the basis for the ties between these two countries. They do not. Other factors pertaining to religion, history, shared values, and domestic politics all figure in the equation. Yet to my mind, interests above all tend to exercise a governing influence. A divergence of interest puts strain on an otherwise friendly relationship. A sharp divergence on matters of fundamental importance can produce severe tension or even an all-out rupture. The issue that forms the foundation of the U.S.-Israeli relationship, the core common interest, is stability. For both countries, regional stability is a substitute for peace. Roughly 10 days ago, in a New York Times op-ed, Israeli ambassador to the United States Michael Oren wrote, quote, "For us, stability is not a 20th century relic. When we say stability, we mean security for our 7.5 million citizens. When we say stability, we mean peace. We do not, however, view stability as a substitute for democracy. Ambassador Oren then proceeded to amend this apparent commitment to democracy by declaring unacceptable any democracy that brings to power groups not to Israel's liking, as is currently the case in Gaza and Lebanon, and as Israel worries might prove to be the case in Egypt. Oren's real message was this: given the choice between stable but non-democratic Arab regimes and democratic but unpredictable Arab regimes, Israel views democratic change with skepticism and considerable anxiety. So let's be clear. As much as politicians on all sides of this matter speak of their commitment to and yearning for peace, both Americans and Israelis will settle for less. They will settle for stability. And why shouldn't they? Stability allows an Israel that enjoys a clear military advantage over any plausible adversary or combination of adversaries, leaving aside for the moment the potential threat posed by a nuclear-armed Iran. It allows that Israel to pursue the Zionist vision of creating a flourishing homeland for Jews. Whereas peace is an invitation to let down your guard, stability, being more tentative, almost necessarily implies keeping your guard up. It provides most of the benefits of genuine peace without the dangers that, say, endorsing the creation of a genuinely sovereign Palestine would entail. This preference for for stability in lieu of peace does not imply passivity on Israel's part. On the contrary, it permits and even requires a consistent pugnacity to deter would-be adversaries, to punish them for bad behavior, or to keep them off balance. From an Israeli perspective, in which even minor threats tend to loom large in prospect, an intense preoccupation with managing near-term stability also provides a welcome distraction from much more daunting challenges that lie over the horizon. For example, demographic trends that threaten the viability of an Israel as an enterprise that is both Jewish and democratic. It's the equivalent of the United States Congress debating whether or not to defund the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, thereby dodging the real issue about how to address this nation's enormous, growing, and unsustainable structural debt. But stability in the Middle East benefits the United States as well. Stability assures continuing access to Persian Gulf oil, essential to the economies of the developed world, even if not immediately essential to the United States itself. Stability ratifies and justifies the U.S. presence and role in the region, allowing Washington to exercise a form of hegemony, or at least to fancy that it is doing so. By providing Israel with a modicum of assurance regarding its own security, stability reduces the likelihood of violence on the scale that occurred in 1967 or 1973, of crucial concern, since any big war that goes badly for Israel could tempt the Israeli government to consider its nuclear option. For any number of reasons, not least of them the importance that Americans attribute, or should attribute, to preserving the taboo against any renewed use of nuclear weapons, this would be a disaster for the United States and for the entire world. Now note that stability does not and will not prohibit Israel from using force on a smaller scale, nor does it prevent groups advocating violence against Israel from doing so, the Qassam rocket attacks as a primary example. But in the larger scheme of things, these qualify as nuisance issues. We should emphasize that this broadly shared interest in stability does not mean that U.S.-Israeli relations have been characterized by sweetness and light. On the contrary, when it has important security-related or economic interests at stake, Israel has never hesitated to disregard U.S. concerns or even to defy Washington. In 1954, for example, Israeli covert agents firebombed U.S. information agency facilities in Egypt with the intention of foisting the blame on Egypt's President Nasser, an act of state-sponsored terrorism directed against the United States. In 1956, the Israeli government colluded in a bizarre scheme to overthrow Nasser, invading the Sinai Peninsula to provide a pretext for British and French forces to seize the Suez Canal and instigate regime change, a violation of both the UN Charter and common sense that shocked and enraged President Eisenhower. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, Israeli officials routinely dissembled when insisting to US officials that Israel had no intention of developing nuclear weapons. Some evidence suggests that Israel subsequently shared its nuclear weapons technology with the apartheid regime of South Africa, further undermining US nuclear non-proliferation efforts. In June 1967, IDF naval and air units attacked and nearly sunk the USS Liberty, an all but defenseless American spy ship then sailing in international waters. 34 American sailors were killed and another 174 wounded. Israel insisted that the incident was an accident. The administration of President Lyndon Johnson was quick to accept Israeli apologies. Others, to include members of the ship's crew, have found the Israeli explanation less than credible, and they are unwilling either to forget or to forgive. After the 1967 war, Israel embarked upon a policy of colonizing territories occupied as a result of that conflict, disregarding objections by authorities in Washington, who declared the resulting settlements as illegal. The Israeli government, or Israeli governments of whatever party, have uniformly disregarded U.S. concerns on this subject. In the 1980s and 1990s, Israel sold billions of dollars worth of military equipment and advanced technology to the People's Republic of China. This at a time when the United States was seeking to prevent or retard China's emergence as a frontline military power. One example, the Lavi fighter jet, designed in Israel, but canceled before going into full production, in all likelihood was reborn as China's J-10. Particularly distressing, as exemplified by the notorious Jonathan Pollard case, Israel has engaged in espionage directed against the United States, suborning American citizens in an effort to steal state secrets. Let me say this as clearly as I can. None of this suggests that we should see Israel as a false friend or rogue state. Rather, it shows that Israel behaves much like any other nation. It does whatever it considers expedient. In this regard, the Israeli government does not differ from the United States or from any other government of any nation faced with pressing security concerns. Sometimes, what appears expedient in the eyes of policymakers turns out to be short-sighted or even stupid. When it comes to short-sightedness and stupidity, my own country, which conceived of schemes like Operation TP Ajax and the Bay of Pigs and lived to rue the day, and which fought an utterly unnecessary war in Vietnam at the cost of 58,000 American lives, my own country takes a back seat to no one. To think that Israel should be any different, to expect Israel to subordinate its perceived interests to ours, or to expect policymakers in Jerusalem to be wiser or more enlightened than policymakers in Washington is to indulge in fantasy. Whether the government of Israel accurately gauges where its true interests lie is another matter. To my mind, the settlement policy was misconceived from the start and imposes shackles on Israeli policy, on Israeli policy options that may produce deeply tragic results. But at the end of the day, that's a matter for Israeli authorities to judge. We are no more in a position to instruct Israelis about what's good for their country than they are in a position to instruct us as to what's good for our country. Anyway, they won't listen to us. And given our track record, why should they? Let's turn next to policy specifics. For Israel, how has this emphasis on stability found expression? The answer to that question comes in four parts, the four principles that define the abiding essence of Israeli national security policy. First, in pursuit of regional stability, Israel maintains sufficient military capabilities to ensure that it can defeat any likely combination of enemies. Second, putting its military superiority to work, Israel visits severe punishment on anyone or anything seeming to pose a possible threat, frequently through preemptive attack. The essential message being this one: even think of messing with us and you'll regret it. Third, Israel cultivates relations with a great power sponsor that can be counted on to provide advanced weapons and technology along with diplomatic cover. That's the role that the United States has played since the 1960s. Fourth, while never budging from propositions 1, 2, and 3, Israel seeks wherever possible to reduce its vulnerabilities. This can be done by acquiring greater strategic depth, for example, controlling key terrain such as the Golan Heights or the west bank of the Jordan River, or it can be done by reducing the number of likely adversaries, for example, by negotiating treaties with countries like Egypt. How has the United States attempted to preserve the stability of the Middle East? Rather than adhering to fixed principles, the U.S. approach has evolved over time, with the trajectory of that evolution over time incorporating aspects of the Israeli approach. We might call this the incremental Israelification of U.S. policy. Let me sketch that trajectory with this abbreviated historical narrative. Truman and Eisenhower sought stability in the region by supporting Israel's right to exist, while trying to minimize the flow of arms into the region and working to keep the Soviets out. The U.S. guaranteed the security of key oil producers such as Saudi Arabia and Iran, but with minimal U.S. military presence in the region. Note that during this period, late 1940s through 1950s, the Middle East was not a top U.S. priority, trailing far behind Europe and East Asia in importance. The Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, Ford, Carter approach acknowledged, endorsed, and over time assumed an obligation to sustain Israeli military superiority. During this time, the U.S. also initiated the so-called peace process aimed at preventing any further recurrence of large-scale conventional war, an effort that achieved success in the Israeli-Egyptian Cold Peace, underwritten thereafter by American largesse provided to both sides. With the U.S. during this period of time doing nothing to avert its growing dependence on foreign oil, the Persian Gulf steadily moved upward in the ranking of U.S. strategic priorities during this period. What became the Reagan, Bush 1, Clinton approach was actually inaugurated by Jimmy Carter with the promulgation of the Carter Doctrine in January of 1980. To my mind, the Carter Doctrine signaled a fundamental shift in the U.S. approach to promoting stability. In essence, the United States now committed itself to actively policing the Persian Gulf and the Middle East more broadly. By 1980, sad to say, the U.S. had completely abandoned any thought of seeking energy independence, thereby circumscribing the range of available policy options. It now sought a position of dominance in the oil-rich Persian Gulf. The emphasis on U.S. military power and U.S. military presence increased accordingly. Permitting and encouraging this effort to assert U.S. dominion was the simultaneous decline and the ultimate demise of the Soviet Union. Each administration during this period made a pretense of looking to the peace process to bring peace, with the Palestinian question now treated as the core issue. But pretense it was. The real action occurred in the realm of hard power, with U.S. exertions focused on dealing with the perceived destabilizers such as Saddam Hussein's Iraq and the Islamic Republic of Iran. This brings us to the Bush 2 approach. With 9/11 and with the persistent defiance of Saddam Hussein suggesting that existing arrangements were breaking down, George W. Bush pulled out all the stops in an effort to use American power to transform the region politically. By promulgating a doctrine of preventive war, the Israelification of U.S. policy now made fully manifest, by promulgating a doctrine of preventive war, the Bush administration conferred upon itself the authority to undertake this project. With its exalted faith in the efficacy of American military might, it set out to impose a new order, or at least to pacify the Middle East. Not only the Middle East, but much of the Islamic world. With success of this enterprise, expected to produce a region less accommodating to either radical Islamists or expansion-minded authoritarians. Now, some in the Bush administration, in all likelihood, expected this project to work to Israel's advantage as well. This approach allowed little space for the so-called peace process, which President Bush openly disdained. It also rejected out of hand the contention, expressed in some quarters, that the real key to putting U.S. relations with the Islamic world on a better footing lay in redressing the grievances of the Palestinians. By the spring and summer of 2003, the U.S. approach to pursuing stability and the Israeli approach to pursuing stability aligned just about perfectly. At least so it seemed for a brief period. Unfortunately, the disappointments of Iraq and Afghanistan showed that the Bush strategy was both unaffordable and impractical. Instead of a new order, Bush produced disorder and permanent war. Indeed, well before President Bush left office, he had abandoned any expectations of transforming the Islamic world. Since 2007, at the latest, U.S. forces have been fighting simply to restabilize what they had destabilized, with little expectation that their sacrifices will yield any larger strategic payoff. Which brings us to the present moment. President Obama inherited this strategic disarray from his predecessor. The new president wisely sought to wind down the U.S. involvement in Iraq, and very foolishly, one might say inexplicably, deepened and prolonged the U.S. war in Afghanistan, now rechristened AFPAC. Although the president's Cairo speech suggested an interest in promoting liberal reform, albeit no longer delivered from the barrel of a gun, the new administration struggled to put words into action. Obama's open-hand approach to Iran produced little by way of a positive response. Tehran had benefited greatly from the mess Bush had made in Iraq, and therefore had less incentive to negotiate, and no particular reason to trust the United States anyway. Obama's efforts to re-energize the peace process likewise went nowhere, obstructed by Israeli unwillingness to take a chance on a genuinely sovereign Palestinian state, and further complicated by the rising fortunes of Hamas and Hezbollah. As with every post-World War II president, except his immediate predecessor, Obama soon found himself in a position where he would gladly settle for some semblance of stability. So where does this leave us with regard to the convergence or divergence of U.S. and Israeli interests? Until fairly recently, I'd have identified the Palestinian issue as the key point where U.S. interests depart from those of Israel. Creating a Palestinian state seemed to me to offer the best way to lay the basis for an alternative to the misbegotten global war on terror launched in the wake of 9/11. To my mind, allowing the likes of bin Laden and other violent anti-Western Islamic radicals to point to the so-called grievances of the Palestinians made it possible for an essentially retrograde and nihilistic political cause to claim some shred of moral justification for its campaign of terror. Stripping away that claim would expose the jihadist cause for what it is, devoid of any justification whatsoever, and yes, evil. Viewed from this perspective, creating a genuinely sovereign Palestinian state rises to the level of a vital U.S. national security interest. I never entertained the notion that the United States could force Israel to allow that state to exist. But as a necessary preliminary step, I viewed it as important for U.S. authorities to state as plainly as possible that on this issue our interests differed sharply from the interests of Israel. Candor might constitute a first step toward finding a solution, to be arrived at, if at all, as a result of what would certainly be very difficult and prolonged negotiations. Certainly sustaining the pretense that there is no daylight between U.S. and Israel, that their enemies are our enemies, as neoconservatives would have it, simply served to obfuscate matters. While putting the Palestinian issue to rest still qualifies as highly desirable from a U.S. perspective, I no longer see it as the central issue. The ground is shifting. The controlling facts are changing. As a consequence, the gap between what serves the well-being of Israel and what is required to advance the security and well-being of the American people has widened appreciably. What are those controlling facts? I will cite three. First, the economic collapse of 2008 and all that has followed it, especially high unemployment, crippling deficits, skyrocketing national debt, and a political system unable to provide a remedy. All of these make clear the imperative of the United States getting its own house in order. We face major domestic challenges that will not easily or quickly be overcome. Fixing America must take precedence over fixing the world, or we'll find ourselves in a position where we won't be able to fix anything. Second, as a corollary of the first, the unipolar moment, if there ever was such a thing, has ceased to exist. It has become abundantly clear that the United States lacks the economic capacity, the military power, and the wisdom to run the world. The 21st century will see the rise of a multipolar order. You can take that to the bank. For the United States, the overriding strategic imperative is to ensure that the emergence of this new order does not replicate the mistakes that produced the horrors of the 20th century. To say that this is a tall order is to understate the case. But the fact is that the future of China and India is far more important in that regard than whatever Osama bin Laden and his ilk are plotting from their caves. The U.S. needs to distinguish between first-order problems and second-order problems. China is a first-order problem. The jihadist threat that has preoccupied Washington for the past decade is not. And it emphatically should not rank as U.S. national security priority number one. Third, and most importantly, indications are now accumulating that the Islamic world can deal with the jihadist problem more effectively than we can. Here's where the dramatic developments of the last few weeks are of such importance. Relying on their own resources and employing means of their own devising, the people of the Middle East have effectively consigned the entire war on terror to the category of strategic irrelevance. When first conceived in the wake of 9/11, two convictions underpinned that war. According to the first, precluding further attacks on the United States meant that the Islamic world needed to change. According to the second, since Muslims were manifestly unable to change on their own, the United States needed to engineer the process. It now turns out that U.S. exertions over the past 9 years have been at the very least superfluous if not counterproductive. For 9 years, we've been pushing in on a door that opens outward. More amazing still, that door swings open of its own volition. Transformation is not something that outsiders can induce or impose or control. The process of change turns out to be organic, spontaneous, and self-sustaining. So Muslims, tired of living in squalor while suffering under the boot of corrupt authoritarian regimes, not infrequently allied with the United States, don't need Washington's coaching. They don't need us to liberate them. They are perfectly capable of liberating themselves. And their doing so basically doesn't cost the American taxpayer a nickel. Now, whether Arab self-liberation will see the rise of prosperous, stable, liberal democracies tolerant of Israel and friendly to the West very much remains to be seen. Yet with the United States doing little more than bearing witness, no need to launch Operation Egyptian Freedom, consuming hundreds of billions of dollars and thousands of American lives, the prospects of democratic change in Egypt and elsewhere in the world are greater today than at any time in memory. But here's the key point. The demonstrators filling the streets in Cairo, Tunis, Tripoli, and other cities give every indication of dreaming dreams not entirely dissimilar from our own. Rather than rejecting modernity, as radical Islamists such as Osama bin Laden have urged, these protesters want a bigger slice of what modernity has to offer. While not guaranteeing harmonious coexistence, these similar, or at least overlapping aspirations suggest that a cosmic clash of civilizations just might be avoidable. The United States should do everything it possibly can to facilitate this process of Arab self-determination. But here's the kicker. In practice, this means for the most part, we should do nothing at all. Rather than trying to bend history to suit our preferences, we need to get out of history's way. To say that we should step aside and let Arabs determine their own future implies a willingness to accept near-term instability with the hope that doing so will produce conditions for more durable stability in the future. A stability that would no longer rely on authoritarian regimes like those of President Mubarak or the Saudi royals to keep the lid on things. For its part, however, Israel is likely to view this prospect of near-term instability as anathema. Out of instability could come Islamist regimes unreconciled to Israel's existence. Out of instability could come a revived radical nationalism of the sort that existed in the Arab world in the 1950s and 1960s. For the United States, the upheaval roiling the Arab world is a moment rich with opportunity, creating an opening that just might allow us to extricate ourselves from the failed war on terror, to husband our scarce resources, and to devote greater attention to more important problems, both at home and abroad. Put simply, we can make real strides toward undoing the damage that we've done to ourselves by allowing our policy to become Israelified. Now, if revolution transforms the Islamic world, that won't erase our record of past folly. It won't give us a clean slate on which to start again, but it just might drain those mistakes of their relevance. Much as, let's say, quitting Vietnam and letting the Vietnamese determine their own destiny has largely rendered the Vietnam War irrelevant to present-day U.S.-Vietnamese relations. For Israel, by comparison, the upheaval roiling the Arab world is understandably fraught with danger. For them, standing aside to let history happen looks like a pretty risky proposition. And that is where we and they now differ quite fundamentally. Yet here's the bottom line. Israeli authorities must attend to Israeli interests. That is their sworn obligation. If that means choosing to persist in the pursuit of stability by relying on the methods that Israel has employed for the past 60 years, then so be it. For their part, U.S. officials must attend to U.S. interests. That is their sworn obligation. And that obligation is one that demands that the United States abandon the means that it has employed, especially over the past 3 decades, in seeking to promote Middle Eastern stability at enormous cost while achieving precious little success. What we all must hope for is that those who make policy in Jerusalem and in Washington will for once distinguish between what appears expedient and what truly serves the well-being of the people for whose welfare they are responsible. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Bacevich. We can now open up to questions, comments on Friday. If you would, well, of course, you go first, please.
You know, thank you very much for your very precise and wonderful thoughts. But in reality now, if the United States had a hands-off policy of letting these people do their own thing, what do they do with all that money that they give to Egypt now? They give a very large amount of money to Egypt, the United States.
I mean, the United States gives money to Egypt.
Pardon?
What happens to the...
Well, what does the U.S. do in relationship to the money they give to Egypt?
Well,
Do they hold
to my mind, determination in this context translates into recognizing, acknowledging, and accepting the political verdict that popular uprisings render. And if indeed, as some fear, the Egyptian revolution results in power being handed through democratic means to the Muslim Brotherhood of Egypt, then it seems to me our appropriate response is to accept that verdict. What does not follow is that we have to bankroll or invest deeply in trying to support this hypothetical Muslim Brotherhood Egypt in pursuing whatever its policy objectives are. With regard to where we lend material support, it seems to me that the criteria would be that we lend material support to governments whose behavior accords with our interests. So let's say that the Muslim Brotherhood gains power through democratic means. If the Muslim Brotherhood would, in that circumstance, then commit itself to maintaining the peace treaty between Egypt and Israel, very much in our interest that they do so, then under those circumstances, I would imagine that we would continue to provide either security or economic assistance to this new Egyptian government.
hold it in abeyance until you see what's going to happen?
I think absolutely. I mean, to my mind, one of the sort of comical aspects, probably what's comical is somebody like me coming over here and pontificating about these events that are still very much in progress. But what's exceedingly amusing to me is the urgent need that people in Washington seem to have to sort of declare what U.S. policy is with regard to what happened in the last 15 minutes. It seems to me that the reality is that there is something very important that is happening that we do not understand and cannot control, And so the better part of wisdom in some respects is to step back and allow things to happen, and once they've happened, to begin to try to interpret the landscape that has resulted. We have no idea where Egypt is going to end up, where Tunisia is going to end up, where Libya is going to end up, or any of the other countries, and you can add Iraq and Iran to the list, once this process plays itself out. And we should be modest enough to acknowledge that we don't know.
Professor Malak.
Yes, thank you very much. I mean, it's hard to agree with you on the Israeli dimension, but in order to sharpen the Bacevich, you seem to present the situation as if the United States had no history in the Middle East. It's not that it has no history. It has a very determined history, and the question is to correct that history. On issues that are very pressing and rather dramatic as you see them, I find it unconscionable if the American government does not lend support to those who are trying to get rid of adversity. And I can't imagine a Security Council resolution emerging as has emerged yesterday if the American government was not lending its leadership to it. I cannot imagine Mr. Mubarak going down with so little blood, relatively, and it has not been clear on the side of the president that he did not want to see the blood of protesters shed by the army. I can't imagine in Bahrain that they would have retreated from the Pearl, that's the army, they have retreated from the Pearl Square had it not been for very clear injunction of the United States to the king and to his army. So my sense is that I would differ profoundly on this hands-off policy. I think what you need is a correction of American policy towards those ideas that you correctly say Arabs and Middle Easterners shared with Americans, rather than this hands-off, rather history-oblivious policy that you suggest.
Well, I have to go back and reread my text to try to figure out how you think I skipped over the history, because it seemed to me that that was quite central to my presentation. We differ, I think, on our estimation of American influence. We probably differ profoundly in our estimation of the efficacy of American power employed in these circumstances. I guess the debate of the moment is whether or not the United States military needs to get involved in the events in Libya, with the notion of a no-fly zone being I think the principal scenario that is being bandied about. And one can say, to the extent that the Gaddafi regime is murdering Libyans in a probably futile effort to extend the life of the regime, one can say that from a humanitarian perspective that's despicable and unfortunate. And yet you can flip it over, it seems to me. When we flip it over, we say is that over the course of the past 10 days, without the United States sticking its nose in, the people of Libya have put the Gaddafi regime on the ropes. They control the majority of the country. They have reduced Gaddafi, in essence, to being the mayor of Tripoli. Let them have their revolution. Let them complete the task that they have begun. Let them achieve the success which they seem to be on the way to achieving. Now, if you invite the United States in, even under the argument that the United States needs to stop the killing, you better be willing to accept what you're going to get. Because once the United States sticks its nose in the door, it just doesn't do what is in the interests of the people of Libya and then turn around and say, glad to have helped out, we're going home again. That history that you cited is not something that we are, I think, going to decisively turn away from. And arguably, to the extent that the behavior of the United States, like the behavior of every other great power in history, is shaped by perceived interests, is not shaped by considerations of what's in the well-being of others, then there's no reason to expect that the United States would act in this beneficent or altruistic way that I think you'd like to see us behave. Just doesn't seem to me that it's in the cards.
Please.
Thanks. You used two words a lot in your presentation. One was stability, and the other was interest. And I hear you didn't talk a lot about stability, although later in your talk you did use the phrase durable stability, which was interesting to me. I hear the word stability as a kind of code, but I can't quite formulate the question I'd like to ask you about that, but I can when it comes to interest. You argued what you think would be a way of understanding what U.S. interests are in the region. But what I'd like to hear you talk a little bit more about is what are the foundations for deciding, for understanding and deciding what are in the interests of a government, of our government? And to what extent are moral criteria, to what extent are questions of justice to be integrated into how we understand what are in the interests of our government, or, and you could say, democratic transformation. And then the obvious companion question, who are making the decisions about what are in the interests of the United States? Because clearly, in my mind, the American people really aren't part of that equation.
I don't think that moral considerations factor in a major way in any decisions made by senior U.S. policymakers. I think that the moral considerations, my guess is moral considerations are an afterthought. That when 4 or 5 or 6 people sit around in the Oval Office trying to figure out what should we do with respect to Libya, what's the right thing, is not the first question that they deal with. Sad to say, I think at the present moment, as we begin to look toward the next presidential election, the first question probably is, how will whatever actions we take affect domestic political concerns? Maybe I'm wrong. I don't think so. And when I say that I don't think that moral considerations figure in a major way in the formulation of U.S. foreign policy, I'm not somehow implying that we are worse than other great powers. Moral considerations did not figure in a significant way in British policy when Britain was the dominant power. And one could say the same thing about any other major power in modern history. We are not that much different than all the rest. Now, as citizens of a democracy, we ought to scrutinize U.S. policy through a lens framed by moral considerations. And yet in doing so, I think we should engage in serious moral analysis, not the kind of moral analysis that says, I really feel bad that there's people in Libya who are getting killed, so can't we go bomb somebody so that I'll be able to sleep better tonight? Because it seems to me that the moral questions related to Libya, related to Afghanistan, you name it, are actually pretty complicated. I would argue that the primary moral obligation of the people who govern is to the people who have elected them. that if President Obama wants to take seriously moral considerations, then he needs to do what is right for the American people. He needs to make good on the concluding language in the preamble of the Constitution of the United States, which says that the purpose of our union is to provide for the blessings of liberty for ourselves and for our posterity. It seems to me that there are a considerable number of Americans, perhaps even more now in this time of economic crisis than a few years ago. There are a considerable number of Americans who do not enjoy the blessings of liberty. I would also say that, given this screwed up fiscal situation in which we're going to get ourselves, that in all likelihood we will seriously circumscribe the ability of the future generations to enjoy the blessings of liberty, because we're going to hand them a bankrupt country. So if we want to talk about moral considerations, let's talk about the moral obligation to the American people. Furthermore, I'm a little bit reluctant to see military action as the appropriate antidote as a way to moralize U.S. policy, for two reasons. One is that, as much as we might like to think that American military power is a precise and predictable instrument, and that war is something that we can manage and control, there's a lot of history, beginning with the Iraq War and Afghanistan War, that says that that's not the case. And to think that you make American policy moral by calling on American soldiers to deal with the task, I think tends to underestimate the negative consequences of using force. And the third thing, and this is something that I have to say I tend to get hot and bothered about, is that Americans who think that sending U.S. forces into a place like Libya or Afghanistan or wherever there's a moral problem that needs to be fixed are in effect saying, for the most part, send somebody else's kid in harm's way. The Americans, I'm not pointing to you, the Americans who believe that American military power provides a way to cut through the moral ambiguity of politics are not volunteering to raise their taxes in order to cover the costs, and they're not volunteering their persons to go accomplish the mission. So again, I don't think that policymakers decide with moral considerations at the forefront of what they're thinking about. I do think that we as citizens ought to constantly interrogate the policies of the country with regard to whether they can be morally defended or not. But we should do that in a serious way. And it seems to me that whenever the moral issue gets tossed out, seldom is it accompanied by serious analysis.
Professor Bacevich, if I understood you correctly, that you think that the Israeli-Palestinian issue is going to be now relegated to the back burner as far as the U.S. policymaking is concerned. Yet, the problem is not going to go away. And in fact, I think that what may happen in West Bank, given the WikiLeaks about Abbas and Fayyad experiment and what has been going on, that despite the fact that West Bank has been quiet now, but once the dust settles in the rest of the region, I think there's going to be an eruption in West Bank. And so it's going to be the Israeli-Palestinian situation is going to be brought back in front and center. We cannot escape our responsibility.
I didn't mean to say that it's to relegate it to the back burner. What I was trying to say is it seems to me that there there's a new set of facts that in a sense transcend the Palestinian issue as the point where U.S. and Israeli interests differ. I think the differences are simply more profound because of the reasons that I cited. But I don't have any reason to disagree with what you just said. I'd like to say, give you my 5-point program that guarantees that we're going to sort this thing out by next Thursday, but the 5-point plan doesn't exist. I tend to look at things from the perspective of the United States because I'm an American. Were I an Israeli Jew, I would not support the creation of a sovereign Palestinian state. Were I an Israeli Jew, I would see those risks to the near-term security and well-being of my country as probably larger than I am willing to take on. And I know that there are, when I give talks like this, there's always somebody who says, hey, we give them $3 billion a year. Why don't we just tell them we're going to take the $3 billion back and then they'll do what we say. My own estimation is that the leverage that we actually have to bring to bear with regard to that question is quite limited. And there will not be a Palestinian state until there is a consensus within Israel that the creation of that state is emphatically consistent with the security concerns of Israel. I'm not seeing that happen anytime soon. It's not happening anytime soon for a variety of reasons related to the right-wing tilt of Israeli politics, at least as I understand it. It's not going to happen because of the weak coalitions that Israeli governments consist of. But until Israel decides that it's willing to accept the existence of that state, I'm not hopeful. Do you see it differently?
But I was just thinking that, I mean, there is now a dramatically changed situation vis-a-vis Israel's southern border, Egypt,
right.
Sinai. So they just cannot leave those problems aside when looking at this issue. So even though Lieberman and others would be completely against it, maybe there are some pragmatic people in Israel who think otherwise.
I don't think I know enough about Israeli politics to know. I mean, I know that there are some pragmatists, but whether or not they can effectively influence Israeli public opinion or Israeli policy, I just don't know.
I have Professor Azizi, and then I'll get you in the second thing, please.
In your portrayal of U.S. options, you contrasted the policy of basically doing nothing versus military involvement. I know that you don't think in such simplistic terms, but I'm wondering, from your perspective, the soft power, the exertion of soft power that is siding with the demonstrators, siding with these movements, providing that kind of rhetorical and moral support, which could be extraordinarily significant under certain circumstances as a message. I wonder if your reservations would lead to a refrain from those kinds of projections.
Oh, no. I mean, I'm all for it. I'm all for the president standing up in the Rose Garden and saying, we side with the people. I think probably where we disagree is I don't believe that that will have a serious effect on the outcome of events. But hey, let us announce that we are in favor of democratic change. Let us be clear that we oppose violence perpetrated against demonstrators. Again, where we differ, I think, is that I don't think that's going to be decisive. To my mind, you used the phrase soft power. To my mind, where our soft power could have a useful effect is after the smoke clears, where the political outcome of a particular revolution suggests that liberal forces are in charge, we should do everything we possibly can to ensure their success. And I think that we do that not in particular by selling them F-16s, but by mustering some amount of effort to encourage development. And this is a very self-interested statement, but it seems to me one of the things we do well is we educate and train. And to my mind, what we ought to invest in huge amounts of money is in providing opportunities for people from that part of the world to come to our schools, or, as is the case, put some of our schools over there in order to train the cadre of teachers and doctors and engineers and scientists who can begin to make real development happen. So I'm for soft power, but I think my version of soft power is somewhat more substantive than yours, but also selective and further down the road in its application.
Very briefly, in my own defense, I didn't mean just the president standing and saying we're with you. By soft power, I guess I would include many of the things that you just pointed to, including the involvement of, the American public, if you will, not just the leaders, and the business dimension is very important too.
But you can't. But I don't think you mean at this moment, or do you mean to take the case of Egypt right now at this moment? Or see, to my mind, we need to wait and see if, in fact, there will be a transition from military government to responsible, constitutional government reflecting the expressed will of the majority of Egyptians. To my mind, it's very uncertain as to whether or not that will be the case.
I have you, please, and then you, Mr. Eisenman, and Professor Hagood. In that order. Please. Yes, speak up, though.
My question is coming back to more about the divergence or convergence of Israeli and U.S. interests. I would like to ask you what you think about the Israeli lobby in Washington and to what extent that influences the decisions coming from Washington and how that can play out in the future, whether there's a path that it might not be as clear as whether it has been in the past or whether it will dominate the future.
Well, thank you for inviting me into that minefield. I mean, to my mind, there is an Israel lobby, and we can now say that out loud. The Israel lobby is well-funded, well-organized, focused, and effective. The Israel lobby does not control U.S. foreign policy. And I think the notion, I don't mean that you suggested this, you did not, but I was on a radio show today and some guy called in with this point, if we can just crush the Israel lobby, then all will be good. I don't think that's the case. Now, and this is not something I follow all that closely, but of course, to some degree, when we say Israel lobby, at this point we are engaged in an oversimplification that misses some important developments. And that is that there are new entities emerging that lobby on behalf of positive U.S.-Israeli relations, but don't necessarily take the hardline view that we tend to attribute to AIPAC. And I'm referring here by way of example to J Street. And it seems to me that we should be somewhat heartened by that because that would suggest that there are elements in the Israel lobby that may take a view that I'll characterize as more enlightened, but of course, whether it's enlightened or not is probably dependent on one's viewpoint. But my bottom line is, I don't think that, I think it is deeply misguided to attribute too much influence to the Israel lobby, or by extension to the neoconservatives.
It's emerged over the past few days that Israeli-Syrian peace talks might be back on the table. Syria hasn't really been touched by protests like we've seen in other countries yet, but arguably has as repressive or more repressive conditions than in some of the other countries that are undergoing peace. What kind of role does the U.S. play in a situation where promoting peace is obviously a good thing, but we're not sure when and if the smoke will ever clear in a country like Syria?
I mean, one question you have to ask is whether or not this is a serious proposition on the part of the Israelis, or whether this is a moment in which they want to demonstrate, at least make a ability, and this is a way to do that. I don't know. I mean, I saw the headline, frankly, didn't read the article, so I don't know much what's going on. This is Ehud Barak is seems to be the mover here. Is that right? I mean, to my mind, again, not that I think that they respond in particular to our considerations. If Israel could find a way to end its antagonistic relationship with Syria in a way that was agreeable to Syria and agreeable to Israel, why would we not favor that? That said, if indeed the larger historical moment is one that suggests that authoritarian regimes may be more vulnerable than we imagined just a few weeks ago, then I would think what we would not want to do would be to have a Rose Garden ceremony with President Obama putting his arms around the peacemakers and the Congress then rushing to appropriate billions of dollars as our sign of approval or our effort to cement the peace. If they want to make peace, go ahead. But I don't think at this juncture we would want to do anything that would identify ourselves with the existing Syrian regime.
Robert? I actually think it should be from today. Back in the 40s, when Arab countries were getting independence, they were meeting, forming the Arab League and so on. Upwards of 70% of the leaders of the states at that time were American educated, either through AUB or AUC, about the college or whatever. And it's a long institutional memory. Revolutionary school in the 1970s, you'd find somebody saying, I want to go to America. I love what you are. And I think we should be supporting, because it's not simply from the squalors, as you said. You see now in Oman, for example, where they're relatively comfortable. It's not about money, it's not about rising from poverty.
back and say, well, the members support the settlements on the Red Bank. I think this government should be active in saying we're on your side. We have a history of supporting this kind of movement, and we're going to do it. I think that's what people, they're perfectly willing to have, to fight for their own.
Well, maybe I should just sort of concede to you guys, because even if we said today, if we all voted in this room and we said, by God, soft power program extended to Egypt, massive amounts, it'll take at least a year for the Congress even to decide what to do, and it'll probably take 3 years before the first dollar got spent in even a remotely effective way. So I should probably concede the argument, because, we can decide we can have an argument down the road of whether it seems appropriate to actually follow through and implement. If there's not some movement in that direction immediately, it won't be effective. Now, with regard to the only argument I can think of for vetoing that Security Council resolution is well, the domestic political argument, but substantively is this: to the extent that an anxious Israel, watching these events unfold with great trepidation, finds some amount of solace and consolation in the conviction that the United States of America will not abandon it, then casting that vote in the Security Council seem to provide some information of our trustworthiness, even if we then have the sort of the comedy of Rice then making a very long speech in which she announced the whole settlement project from top to bottom. That's the only rationale I can think of for why it may have made some sense to do that. I would reframe the issue. And I'd reframe the issue this way, that the question becomes whether or not we are able to define interests in a relatively enlightened way that will take into account, to a degree, interests and the well-being and the aspirations of others, and to do that not because we're in the altruism business, but because an enlightened definition of what we should be pursuing contribute in the long run to the safety and well-being of the American people. Well, no, I think that's true. We are damned if we do, and we're damned if we do nothing. To some degree, the question is, down which path does greater damnation lie? And maybe probably I am placing too much weight on the events of the past decade, where an administration with a profound confidence in its own wisdom, in its ability to manipulate events, in its belief in the efficacy of American military power, boldly and recklessly chose to go down one of those paths, with consequences that, to my mind, are that boggle the mind. whether we're talking the trillions of dollars that our wars will ultimately cost, if you go by the estimates of Professor Stiglitz, whether you talk about the thousands of Americans that have been killed, whether you talk about the even larger number, many more thousands of Americans who are damaged. I don't know if you see them on your campus, but from time to time I see them on my campus. And yes, let us not forget that probably well over 100,000 Iraqis who are killed. There may be, what, 2.5 million Iraqis that are in exile. The mayhem that we are creating in our effort to pacify Afghanistan and Pakistan. And to somehow imagine that, well, that was all those dopey Bushies. But now we've got a different, wiser administration in, and they'll be able to come up with a better outcome. I guess I'm just too jaded and cynical. I don't think these guys would do any better. I mean, it's striking. Secretary Gates' speech got a little bit of play, but I think sort of been vanished. Serving Secretary of Defense, Republican in a Democratic administration, probably the most respected senior official in Washington today, says, speaking to cadets at West Point, if any future Secretary of Defense suggests to any future President of the United States that we should go send a large army into Asia, the Middle East, or Africa, he ought to have his head examined. So maybe I'm a little gun-shy, but I think that there's considerable evidence to support my view.
We have time for one more question, and it'll be you.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you for a wonderful presentation. I'm very much interested in looking at U.S. actions from U.S. perspective, U.S. self-interest perspective, and very much agree that Israeli lobby cannot be offered as a reason for U.S. actions all over the world, as it sometimes is. I do wonder, though, about the veto, about condemning the settlement that we were just referring to. Doesn't that pose a little bit of a problem to your theory of self-interest? Because if the only explanation we can come up with if we eliminate the lobby and we want to look at self-interest is that the U.S. wanted to help Israel feel better. It just seems a problematic kind of approach and with self-interest. I'm wondering, I was baffled by it. I was genuinely baffled by it.
By the veto?
Yeah. Not because...
I mean, you were surprised?
I was surprised not because it didn't happen 1,000 times before, but I was surprised when I looked at U.S. interest, and I asked myself, why? What is it about this administration, not the Bush administration, that needs to do this? This is not taking money from Israel. Actually condemning the settlement will mean absolutely nothing. The UN will do nothing. It will condemn and has been condemning for a long time.
Right.
It doesn't mean anything. And yet the U.S. insists on this action, and it does not seem to fit with its self-interest.
Well, I mean, again, I'll quickly concede that there are domestic political considerations that probably were not trivial in informing the decision for the vote to go the way it is. I mean, we'd be naive to think otherwise. But I mean, the only self-interested argument I can come up with is the one I gave you. And I guess the reason I give you that is because maybe I'm way off base in this regard. But I think that the principal purpose of the Israeli nuclear arsenal is to bind us to them, to have any American president who is thinking about a fundamental change, who is thinking of a turning away from Israel, that any American president will necessarily have to and should consider the implications of doing so for the possibility of nuclear war in the Middle East. Because an Israel that believes that its survival is on the line in that kind of extreme circumstance, to my mind, will not hesitate to employ nuclear weapons. And as I tried to suggest in the talk, I think that as the country that invented the damn things, as the country that used the damn things, as a country that in the late 1940s and 1950s basically designated the possession of nuclear power as the metric by which power gets measured, we have a profound interest in trying to walk that back. And therefore, we have a profound interest in doing everything we possibly can to ensure that nuclear weapons will never be used again. And I think that, maybe with the possible exception of India, Pakistan dust up, that Israel is the most likely country with nuclear arms to use nuclear arms. I can see you leaning way forward. You're going to jump at me.
Moral, I think. God forbid I would say. That sounds like a moral interest. As the country who invented the A-bomb and bombed Hiroshima and Nagasaki, we morally are responsible to take this back. It just sounds like a moral kind of language to me rather than self-interest. Why would you care? You're all the way. You're away from that fact.
We care because if nuclear weapons come to be seen as politically useful, then the bomb that goes off in the Middle East is unlikely to be the last one to go off. But I mean, again, I'll concede a point here, and that is that, again, it's not that I think that policymakers think about this. I personally am troubled by the hypocrisy of the United States with regard to this whole question. And not because I think American policymakers will think in these terms. From a moral perspective, I think, I wish the United States, wishing doesn't make it happen. I wish the United States recognized an obligation to take a position of leadership on this issue, rather than approaching it in what I think has been a kind of niggardly, it's worse than pragmatism, but I wish we had been bolder in this regard.
So I'm sorry, I'm going to have to cut this off because we have to move on to the next assignment with Professor Bacevich, but has to take on for us. But we're grateful to you, sir, for coming to us. I hope you'll come back. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.